And so I'm a little giddy because I'm excited that we have Bob Russell here. If you don't know who Bob Russell is, I think he came on staff at the church, Southeast Christian Church, 22 years old. Is that right? And it was about 120 people. And I think he was there for 40 years, Bob? Yeah, 40 years. And by God's grace, the church grew to a small church of 18,000 people. Huge church, very influential in the U.S. And I've heard of Bob over the years. I used to read several of his books, read a lot of his sermons online. And so when Chester and I were planning for Men's Fraternity this year, we knew we wanted to go through Genesis, but we really were looking for kind of a video series so we can really get some great teaching. But we really had a hard time finding anyone who's ever been through the book of Genesis and has a video to show for it. And so one day Chester emails me and says, "Rob, I found someone. Have you ever heard of Bob Russell?" And I was like, yes. I don't even have to even look at it. I know the content's going to be great. Chester, that's the one. He's like, great, good. And so then I had one of our assistants reach out to him because I knew he was retired. I'm like, I don't know if he would want to come. And to our surprise, Bob said, "I'd love to come to California." I said, great. And so he's been married for over 50 years. Unbelievable. Grandkids, books. And now he lives the retired life. And he's a pastor to pastors. And he's coming here tonight all the way from Louisville, Kentucky. Please give a warm welcome to Bob Russell.
Thank you, Ron. Well, good evening. I am really encouraged to see this size church and this kind of vitality this close to San Francisco. And I congratulate you on that. I'm honored to be here. Thank you. I'm honored that you watched the video study in Genesis. I go places where they watch it, and people will say to me when I go speak, "Did you bring your son Phil with you, since he's the reader, or can you read?" And but I'm honored to be invited to come all the way across the country to talk with you men, because I don't consider myself a dynamic speaker. I went into the ministry kind of kicking and screaming because the one thing that I didn't like doing in high school was getting up in front of people and reading or speaking. I was terrified in front of people. I could play basketball in front of thousands, but to get up in front of a class and read, I know it's hard to look at me and believe I play basketball, but I was 6'5" in high school. Church just kind of beats you down over a period of time. But once I started speaking, I found out people would listen. I'm not a high-octane speaker that immediately grabs people's attention, but to teach the Bible and the Word of God has really been a blessing to me. I was over in Korea several years ago, and I walked into the room where I was to speak. It seated about 2,500 people. There must have been 3,000 people at the Korean Christian Convention. And this convention was a lot more charismatic than I'm accustomed to, and people were shouting amen, and they were in the aisles, and the Korean preachers who prayed, they were a lot more dynamic in their speaking and their praying than I was in my speaking. And I began to feel pretty insecure because I was going to get up and speak to this crowd through an interpreter. And that's not the kind of crowd that I normally go over very well. So I wrote a little note to my administrative assistant, and I said, "I think I'm in trouble." And I slid it over, and I saw him write "just," and I knew what he's going to say, "Just be yourself." He slid it back over and says, "Just pep it up a little." So I hope that I can keep your attention tonight because you've brought me all the way across the country. But I love speaking to men and to men only. We started a men's Bible study on Saturday morning at 7 a.m. and the thing grew. It was kind of like a men's stag party on Saturday morning. We never had guys bring condoms up, but we had a good time. But I like speaking to men because you can talk about things that you probably wouldn't talk about in mixed company. And I can tell jokes that I couldn't tell in mixed company. Not raunchy jokes, but there's some jokes that you just wouldn't think is appropriate. For example, you heard about the bank robber stood in line at the bank? They got up to the teller and he pulled a gun out and said to the teller, "Give me all your money." And she nervously gave him the money. And he turned to the guy behind him and said, "Did you see me rob that teller?" She said, "Yes, I did." Boom, he just shot the guy. Then he turned to the couple behind him and said, "Did you see me rob that teller?" And the guy said, "I didn't see it, but I think my wife did." Now, see, you'll laugh about that here, but if your wife was sitting beside you, I just don't think that's appropriate at all. Since you're studying in Genesis, I want to go all the way back to Genesis, the 2nd chapter, and I want to talk with you about how men are wired. Now, let me tell you why this subject has particularly been on my mind. I had two friends in ministry who in the last several years have cheated on their wives. Now, you would have never guessed these guys would do that. They were in a sermon study group with me. They were both in their 50s. They both had churches over 1,000 people, and they both had good families. But Satan enticed them, and they stumbled and fell, and one lost his family altogether. Both lost their church. They wounded, hurt so many people, and they gave the enemy of Christ an occasion to blaspheme. And probably everyone in this room could recount Christian friends that you have that have stumbled and fallen in a big way like that morally. And we hope we can bring them back and restore them, but it's sometimes a long road back. But think about the public figures who have fallen morally in recent years, lost their careers, their influence, become the brunt of ridicule. Politician Anthony Weiner, Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein, General David Petraeus, comedian Bill Cosby, Al Franken, Judge Roy Moore, Charlie Sheen, Charlie Rose, Kevin Spacey. And the Christian community the last year has been so upset and shocked that of the evidently credible accusations against Bill Hybels, leader of one of the best churches in America. And if we're honest, everybody in this room would admit that we struggle with sexual temptations of lust, pornography, inappropriate thoughts, flirtations. So I want to talk with you tonight about the distinctiveness of men as God created us, so that you understand why you're tempted, and more importantly, you're able to repeatedly gain victory in this area. You know, in the book of Jude, it says the gospel ought to be able to keep us from falling. The gospel should not just be an ambulance at the base of the cliff to pick up people who have fallen over and wounded themselves. The gospel ought to be a fence at the top to prevent people from falling in the first place. And I think it'll help us to look at Genesis again and be reminded that from the very beginning, God created men and women differently. Now, a few years back, the feminist movement tried to convince us that men and women were the same emotionally. The only difference was in the plumbing. But that idea was short-lived because it is so contrary to reality. Along came the book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. Some time ago, I came across a list that illustrates the difference between men and women. It said you can tell men and women are different by the use of the remote control, the length of time it takes to get ready for bed, the approach to shopping, how they determine if clothes are dirty, men by sight, women by smell. Men tie their self-esteem to achievement, women to relationships. Women stop for animals in the road, men don't. Men stop for a flat tire, women don't. Men don't wear other men's clothing or invite other men to go to the restroom with them. And it says you'll never see a man clean or a woman clean her ear with a car key. We're different. And that's what makes marriage and relationships interesting and challenging. And if we understand how we're wired, I think it'll help us overcome temptation, be more compassionate, patient husbands. So here's what Genesis 2, beginning with verse 20, says in describing the difference in creation. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds of the air and all the beasts of the field. But for Adam, no suitable helper was found, so the Lord God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took one of the man's ribs and closed up the place with flesh. Then the Lord God made a woman from the rib he had taken out of the man, and he brought her to the man. And the man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of the man. And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. The man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame." Now in your notes, I got a little note taker so you can follow along. I want you to see 4 distinctives about men from this passage that I hope will help us. The first is God created man with an innate physical attraction for women. God made a woman for Adam, beginning with his rib. And when Adam woke up from the anesthesiology, he sees Eve for the first time, and he goes crazy and he says, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. He immediately is attracted to her. Now, Adam does not know anything about her personality. He doesn't know anything about her IQ. He doesn't know anything about her sense of humor. He doesn't know anything about her mood swings. He just knows he is attractive to her. And he said, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Tim Timmons says the real translation is, wow, that's great, God. Wrap her up, I'll take her. On second thought, don't wrap her up at all. I'll just take her as she is. You know what this tells me? God made us, he wired us so that we are visually driven. Women are, for the most part, emotionally driven. But we are wired in such a way that just seeing an attractive woman draws our attention and stimulates desire. The next time you're in a room and a pretty woman walks in, instead of you looking at her, watch the men. Everybody in the room, even the most spiritual, will take a glance. Jesus said a man is not to look at a woman to lust after her. But he didn't say you don't appreciate beauty. There's a difference between appreciating beauty and lust. And when God converts you, he does not strike you blind. Now, I know some of you have wives who get upset if you even glance at a pretty woman. That's unrealistic. What you need to say to your wife is, look, if I didn't appreciate beauty, I would have never married you. You can say that, won't make any difference, but I mean, you can say that to her. I was playing golf. We were talking about golf. I was playing golf with three guys my age, old geezers. And we're in Gatlinburg, and this cart girl came by, hot day, and she was scantily clad. She's very pretty, too. And none of us acted like we even noticed, because the preacher was there, but one was ex-spiritual. One guy said, I'll buy. He bought, and she went on, and we took our Cokes and went to the next tee. And the guy who bought teed up his ball and started addressing, and he stepped back and said, you think $25 was too big a tip for that girl? We can pretend we don't notice, but we notice. Now, Jesus said it's wrong to look lustfully, to crave as your own, or to imagine sinful involvement. That's the problem with pornography. Pornography deliberately stimulates lust. The Bible says, don't even think about how to gratify the desires of your sinful nature. And the problem with pornography is that it is addictive. There is a law of increased appetite and diminishing return that takes over. And you want more and deeper and weirder stuff. And the problem with pornography is that it can eventually make you impotent. Nothing stimulates anymore. I am convinced that all the ads we see on TV today about ED are not just because as men get older, physically they have problems. It's that people are overstimulated and natural attraction is not enough. And let me say to you guys, Stephen Arterburn wrote a book, Every Man's Battle. And this is just about every man's battle every day. And if you find yourself in the grip of that addiction, you probably aren't going to get out of it unless you are honest with another man. And you say, brother, I have a problem. Can I be accountable to you? Will you help me? As iron sharpens iron, we can sharpen one another. As long as you keep that a secret, you probably won't overcome it. But two are better than one. So confess that and overcome it, because it can get a grip on you. But men are wired to be visually stimulated by a physically attractive woman. And because you are attracted does not mean you're a pervert. That's just the way God wired you. I taught high school class years ago, and I had this lesson on dating and marriage, and I listed on the board all the qualities that you should look for in a mate. And I put faith, finances, personality, attractiveness, background, heredity, all those things. Now I said, I want the girls and I want the boys to list these qualities in order of priority. What do you think all the guys had right up the top? Physical attraction, that was most important. So I took about 10 minutes, had this long lecture on why faith was more important than physical attractiveness, and why. One teenage boy raised his hand, Mr. Russell, he said, you know, you can convert a pretty girl, but you can't make an ugly Christian pretty. I couldn't think of an answer either. Now, why did God create us with this automatic desire for somebody physically attractive. I think 3 reasons. One is to encourage procreation. God commanded Adam, now you be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And Adam said, I'll be glad to do that. Now, women instinctively want to mother children. But you hardly ever hear teenage boys say, boy, I can't wait to get married and have children who wake me up in the middle of the night. No, he can't wait to get married so that he can have sex. And God placed that physical attraction in men so that we would replenish the earth. The second thing is we're attracted physically to women to motivate us to get married. Just after Adam said, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, that's when God said, all right, Adam, for this cause. What cause? Since you're attracted to the woman. You leave your father and mother and you cleave, a monogamous relationship, you cleave to your wife and the two become one flesh. George Gilder is a secular writer who authored a book, Men in Their Marriage. This is from a secular guy. He makes this point repeatedly. Women marry for love, men marry for sex. That's why women make a huge mistake moving in with a man without marriage, he says. That's why the majority of these relationships fail. Once man can have sex with a woman whenever he wants, he loses the drive to make a permanent commitment. Now, a lot of you guys have daughters. And one of the greatest gifts you can give to your daughter is you be loving and reaffirming to them. I'm so grateful for a wife who is affectionate because her daddy was affectionate to her. And along the way, you as a Christian father, along with your wife, need to teach this to your daughter. How men are wired, they get married for sex. And they need to understand that that sexual desire does not go away if a man is married for 10 or 20 years. Understand it intensifies with every passing day it isn't fulfilled. And if you deny it and delay it too long, you're headed for disaster. One of those 2 preachers I said cheated on his wife, I didn't communicate with him for a couple of years. I was so angry. I finally communicated with him. He emailed me back and said, I know everything looked great. Everything in our marriage looked great, but there's one thing wrong. We would go sometimes 6 months without my wife responding to me. And eventually, I know it's no excuse, but I went into a cold, dark place. And we need to teach our daughters that if the husband goes for weeks without intimacy, they are sending a starving man out into a world that's a food court with sweet aromas, drawing them to free samples of delicious looking but poisonous cuisine. That's why 1 Corinthians 7:5 says, don't deprive each other except by mutual consent so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So God gave us sex to procreate, also to motivate men to get married. And the third reason is it promotes healing and forgiveness in marriage. Once we say I do, we discover that marriage is more difficult than we thought. God has made us very different. We discover in marriage, boy, a whole lot more to marriage than just having sex. Women discover that men can be insensitive and sloppy, and men discover that women are complex, and it's a challenge to keep them happy. Philip Yancey wrote a book, Holy Sex, How It Ravages Our Souls, and he says, we live with people who require compassion, tolerance, understanding, and an endless supply of forgiveness, and so do our partners. Such is the ironical power of sex. It lures us into a relationship that others, to teach us what we need far more, sacrificial love. You know what it's like, man? You get upset with your wife and you withdraw. You go maybe for days without speaking. And pretty soon your sexual desire begins to increase and you begin to plan for ways to maybe get back together and forgive. Yancey says, in a sense, the pleasure of sex is God's compensation for working through some of the aggravations of marriage. Okay, here's the second thing I want you to see. God created man with a need for intimate companionship that can be totally fulfilled only in a marriage commitment. The Lord God said, it is not good that man is alone. I'll make a helper suitable for him. I'll make a companion. God didn't just create a woman to be our sexual playmate. He created her to be a companion to us. And God could have created a woman from the dust of the ground the way he created Adam. But he took a rib from Adam's side and created a woman to symbolize the closeness emotionally of this relationship. It is my observation men do not do alone very well. Widows recover more easily than widowers. And divorced women usually do better more quickly than divorced men. Men's sexual drive is such that he thinks that all he needs is sexual satisfaction. But in reality, in the heart of every one of us, there is this craving. Instinctively, God has wired us for companionship with the opposite sex. I'll prove that to you. Hugh Hefner died last year. And for years he had a television program from the Playboy Mansion. He had 3 young women with him in the mansion. Whole life just sexual indulgence, hedonism. But in his 80s, Hugh Hefner decided he wanted to get married again. Why? Because in the heart of every one of us, there's this desire for somebody of the opposite sex, this rib of our life, to be close to us. In his book, His Needs, Her Needs, Willard Harley lists the 5 most important needs of husbands. This is probably a review for you. It's a well-known book. Let me go over it real quickly. He says the husband needs, number 1, sexual fulfillment. He says that's one thing that we have a difficult time doing without. We can if there's physical problems, but it's number 1 desire. He points out other needs. The second is for recreational companionship. We want our wife to be our playmate. We want our wife to share our hobbies. We want them to go fishing with us or ride the motorcycle with us or sit down and watch a ball game on TV. We want her to share some of her hobbies. The third need is for an attractive spouse. He wants his wife to be good looking. This has to do with the male ego. The wife is kind of our trophy. Look what we caught. I've never listened to guys, somebody tell them, your wife is really pretty. You know what guys say? Well, thank you very much. Like he had something to do with it. She was really homely before I got a hold of her, but I got her straightened out. No. That's why we're concerned about weight and appearance and hair. We want them to be attractive because that's our trophy. Then he says we have a need for domestic support. We have a lot of hassle, a lot of pressure at work, and when we come home at night, we don't want a lot of hassle. We don't want the wife to greet us and say, hey, you got a leaky faucet. We need you to take out the garbage. We need you to mow the grass. No, he wants domestic support. And finally, he needs admiration. He needs the wife to be proud of him. Someone asked the wife of Jack Dempsey, the boxer, what it was like to be married to a boxer. She said, I didn't marry a boxer, I married a champion. And every man wants to be a champion in his wife's eyes. Someone said every woman needs to be loved, every man needs to be admired. And that's why God said, a man shall leave father and mother, cleave to his wife, the 2 become one flesh. Now we're not being fair, we don't go to the other side. Here are Willard Harley's 5 needs of women. Number 1 is affection. They need to be valued, they need to be put on a pedestal. Hey guys, if you can convince your wife that she is always the most important person in your life and more important in your job or sports, that'll go a long way to her giving you a lot of freedom and being happy at home. Number 2, she needs conversation. She will say to you, please tell me what you're thinking and feeling. And what she's really saying is, please listen to me when I tell you what I'm thinking and feeling. Thirdly, she needs trust. Total security is important, more important to a woman. That's why if you lose your job, she's more upset than you. That's why an affair is so devastating to a woman because her foundation of security is shaken. Fourthly, she needs financial security. She wants to be able to live comfortably. You don't have to be rich, but she doesn't want the hassle of worrying about how the next bill is going to be paid. And fifthly, she needs family commitment. She wants you to be a good father, relate well to her family, to be a godly husband. Now, if you're a godly husband, you're going to be sensitive to your wife's needs. If you want her to be your companion, then you're the initiator, you're the leader in the home. It is up to you to respond, to nurture those needs we've just mentioned. I got to tell you, my first few years of marriage, I wasn't a very good nurturer. I neglected my wife. I'm so thankful for a good wife who never complained, but she told me later she was lonely at times. Because when I went to Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky, as Rob mentioned, I was 22 years old. And I knew I was way out of my league. I grew up in the country. This church was in the city. I grew up in a little church of 40 people. This church had the potential to grow large. I had a BA degree from Bible college. This church was full of people with PhDs. And I said, if I'm going to make it in this environment, I'm going to have to be focused. And so I worked hard. I was gone many nights to meetings and calling. And I came home, I was exhausted. And when I came home, I didn't want to talk to anybody. I just wanted to veg out. You know what I mean? And so my wife, the person I love most, got the least amount of my energy. And sometimes when I was home, I wasn't really home. I'd work at home, let phone calls interrupt us. One night, a few years later, I got a telephone call from my wife telling me that she was going to be working late and she's going to be late getting home. But I answered the phone so late that the answering machine kicked on and recorded my conversation. I didn't know it. 10 minutes later, I looked, the red light was on. I said, oh, I've got a voicemail. Pushed the voicemail, and I listened to the conversation with my wife, and I couldn't get over the energy and the lilt in her voice and the deadness in mine. The conversation went something like, Bob, you having a pretty good day? Okay. What are you doing? Reading newspaper. Well, I just called to tell you you're going to be a little late coming home. We got hung up, probably be an hour late. Okay. Well, do you want me to bring something home to eat? You want to go out to eat? What do you want to do? Doesn't matter. Okay, see you in a little while. Okay. And I was convicted. I mean, I just read a book with a chapter entitled, Are You Fun to Live With? I said, you know, I'm not fun to live with. If I die, I want Judy to shed at least one tear. And I said, I knew in my heart, if that'd been the average person from church calling me, my response would have been a lot more energetic. I'd have said, yeah, having a pretty good day. How's yours going? Well, I'm reading this article about football. Have you read it? Oh, don't hurry. Take your time. Don't want you to have an accident or anything. Anything is okay. But my wife, the person who matters most to me in life, yeah, okay. So I made up my mind from that point on, I was going to change. And I learned the value of shifting gears. At the end of the day, when I left church, 5 o'clock, I would say to myself, Lord, that's the best I can do. I'm behind on my sermon. I've got some emails I need to answer, but I'm leaving them here. I'm not taking them home. I'm going to get up early tomorrow and come. I'm going to go home and be focused on my family, even though it takes additional effort. I've got a friend in ministry who for 60 years pounded a nail in the garage, between the garage and the house, in the door. He said people thought that was to hang a hat, but in reality, that's where he hung all the junk that happened during the course of the day so he could focus on his wife. And I discovered that my marriage started getting better. We communicated more, we laughed more, we got closer, and my wife was so much more of a companion to me when I became energetic and started nurturing her needs. Shortly after that decision, I was with teenagers my wife and I were serving pizza in the kitchen. And I looked across the table at Judy that night, and she looked pretty attractive to me, and I winked at her. And she looked away like she was embarrassed. About an hour and a half later, I'm sitting in the easy chair at home. She came up behind me and put her arm around my neck, kissed me on the back of the neck. She said, you know what that does to me when you wink at me in public? No, but I found out and I'm going to do it again. It's amazing what can happen in companionship if we give energy ourselves. Okay, here's the third thing I want you to see. God created man with a dangerous vulnerability to sexual temptation. From the beginning, God put protective boundaries around the sex drive. He said a man is to cleave to his wife. Later he adds, man is not to commit adultery. Driving a car is a wonderful privilege, but a dangerous privilege. And so there are restrictions. You have to be 16 in our area. You got to be physically, mentally capable of handling a vehicle, no drunk driving, speed limit. Because a 12-year-old could drive a car physically, but he doesn't have the emotional stability or the mature judgment to be given that privilege. Sex is a wonderful but dangerous privilege. And God designed it to be expressed in the boundaries of marriage only. Now, he didn't put those restrictions to repress us or to prevent us from having a good time, but because he wants us to have the most fulfilling, the most satisfying life here, free of disease, free of envy, free of insecurity, and stability for the kids. But men are particularly vulnerable to temptation in this area. In Kentucky, we got the Kentucky Derby. And the thoroughbred horses are the fastest horses for 2 minutes. But they have, in order to be fast, they got these extremely thin legs. And they are vulnerable to breakdown. The advantages are speedy. The disadvantage is they can break down easily. Men are wired by God to be sexually driven, but there comes with that this tremendous temptation, as David, Samson, Solomon in the Bible demonstrated. When you combine an attractive woman who knows how to boost a wounded man's ego with man's sinful nature that has been inherited from the days of Adam, it begins to explain how all these men can fall so disastrously. A guy named Steve Chapman has written a book called A Look at Life from the Deer Stand. He tells about sitting quietly in a tree stand when suddenly he heard the brush near him crashing. He knew something was rapidly coming through the woods near him. His adrenaline was rushing, so he pulled his rifle to his shoulder and slipped the safety off. Sure enough, here came a doe bounding across in front of him, followed by a buck chasing after her. Now, Steve paused to point out that deer have a very keen sense of smell and a very keen sense of hearing, that they will be spooked by the slightest sound, except when they're in mating season. He said this buck was only 40 yards away. He took aim with his .30-06, but missed him twice. He said, I was really exasperated, but I was surprised that the deer didn't seem to notice or acknowledge my existence. He said, I could have been playing a piano in the tree stand and the buck wouldn't have mattered, it wouldn't matter at all to the buck. But within a few seconds, he heard another crashing, and incredibly, here the two came again. The same two deer, running from the opposite direction. And Chapman wrote, I couldn't believe it. It occurred to me that old buck might not have known or even cared that I was there, but hey, that doe must have known. I kind of think she was bringing him back by, giving me another chance. In fact, I do believe I heard a female voice as they were coming through the second time screaming, shoot him, shoot him, shoot him. Steve says he missed twice again, and the two deer disappeared. He adds, though acting on instinct, that buck cast aside its normal self-protective use of his big ears and keen sense of smell, and all that was crucial for survival in the wild was traded for a chase. A deer's mating season lasts 4 to 5 weeks of the year, and it's not unusual for the white-tailed buck to act crazy during this period. And the bottom line is that during mating season, a buck sure makes an easy target of himself. We had a speaker in our church that said something that I've never forgotten. It's kind of crude, but he said, men, don't throw everything away for a muscle spasm. Think about what's at stake. Thomas Sowell, the philosopher, said, you know what, when a pretty woman walks in the room, the average IQ of men goes down 30 points. We are vulnerable. Recognize you're vulnerable. Here's the last thing I want you to see. God created us with a capacity of disciplining our desires and honoring God. In our victim-oriented society, we're all tempted to rationalize our behavior. But God said, you cleave to your wife. I want you to be monogamous. But we've got all kinds of excuses. I can't help it. I'm addicted. Everybody does it. I can't expect to live a celibate life. Our physical desires are strong, but our egos are great, but they can be controlled. A youth minister told me he was talking with one of his kids in youth group, and the kid said, you know, what you're asking me to do to be celibate, that's impossible. I started making out with my girl, I can't stop. He said, really? He said, say you're sitting on the couch making out with your girlfriend, and all of a sudden you hear the garage door go up, and your girlfriend says, hey, my mom and dad are here. Could you stop then? He said, well, I thought he could. It all depends on what you're listening to. If you're listening for the voice of God, you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. But we got this philosophy today, just do what you feel like doing. If the chemistry's right, go for it. Let's understand, guys, there are two natures within every one of us. You're created in the image of God. You want to do the right thing. But you're also polluted by the sin nature of Adam. And that sin nature drags you down. And that sin nature can be different. Some people struggle with temper. Some people struggle with greed. Some people struggle with same-sex attractions. Some people struggle with laziness. But we don't say to a young boy with temper, well, go ahead and throw things. Go ahead and hit people. No, we say practice self-control. And the Bible says in 1 Peter 2:11, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world, abstain from evil desires that war against your soul. You can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. You're not a victim of your carnal nature. Joseph in the Old Testament was in his mid-20s when Potiphar's wife grabbed him by the arm and said, come to bed with me. And Joseph said, I can't do this thing and sin against my God. And he turned and fled. And we consider Joseph a hero because he resisted the evil desires that war against his soul. The book of Galatians, the 5th chapter, says that we are, if we live by the Spirit, we don't gratify the desires of the flesh, because the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the sinful nature. They're at war with each other so that you don't do what you want. We have a guy in our church named Greg Allen, who was our youth minister and then became our worship leader. Really neat guy. But when he got married in his early 20s, he asked me to perform his wedding. And I was with him in a fellowship hall, and he was pacing nervously. And just minutes before the wedding ceremony, he said, Bob, can I tell you a secret? I said, sure, and I later got his permission to share with others. He said, you know, Lori and I started dating when we were freshmen in high school. And since we were both Christians, we made a vow that we would be celibate until marriage. He said we dated all through high school, and then we went to different colleges, but we kept on dating for 4 more years. And it was really difficult to keep that vow. But you know what? We did. And tonight, I'm really glad that we did. And you know what? That's rare. But it was one of the most impressive wedding ceremonies I've ever been to. Also one of the shortest wedding receptions I've ever been to, too. But I look at Greg Allen today with his 3 beautiful daughters and his grandchildren and how God honors us when we obey his word, that we have this capacity within us to do all things through Christ and to resist the evil desires that war against our soul. One of the presidents we admire most is Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln endured a marriage that was a very difficult marriage. He was married to a woman named Mary Todd, and she was a woman of tremendous discontent. He suffered a number of indignities at the hands of his wife. She threw coffee in his face. She went on bizarre spending binges. And shortly after their wedding, she complained that he didn't make enough money. Everybody with status had a 2-story house. They just had a 1-story house. He went on a trip. When he came back, she had hired a carpenter, put on a 2nd story to their house. He was in debt. And then in the White House, he grieved the passing of his son, but he just couldn't get over Mary Todd's prolonged utter despondency. Gary Thomas, in his book, Sacred Marriage, points out the Lincoln's marriage prepared him for his bigger mission. He said, it's easy to see how a man might quit on a difficult marriage and then they would not have the character to hold together a crumbling nation. Lincoln was determined to save the Union. What better training ground than the difficult marriage that required such tenacity from him? Lincoln's difficult marriage, Gary Thomas writes, did not deter him from achieving greatness. One might argue that it actually helped him prepare for greatness. And you know what? When people talk about the greatest presidents, Lincoln's always right at the top. Mary Todd, always right down the bottom. And that kind of exposes the lie that people say, well, I could have done something if I hadn't married such a loser. And Gary Thomas says, marriage is kind of spiritual boot camp. God doesn't want us, he doesn't prepare marriage for our happiness, but for our holiness. That's why Socrates said years ago, by all means get married, and if you have a good marriage, you'll be happy, and if you have a bad one, you can become a philosopher. Let me close by telling you about one of my favorite men in ministry. He's a man by the name of Russ Blowers. He preached in Indianapolis at the East 91st Street Christian Church for almost 50 years. This kind of a saintly guy, always faithful to his family and his wife. This church is a great church, grew and planted churches. And when he retired, a reporter asked Russ Blowers what he's proudest of in his life. And here's a guy who led the Billy Graham Crusade and led this great church. He said, I guess the thing that I'm proudest of is that I've never had to go in my kid's bedroom and explain why their dad was unfaithful to their mother. That's kind of the legacy I'd like to live. That's what I'd like to be known for. Not Bob Russell preached to the big church, or Bob Russell wrote a book. I'd like for my children, my grandchildren, to look and say, you know what? Our dad, our granddad, he loved her mother. Louis Foster, a professor of mine in school, used to say, evil, though done with pleasure, the pleasure soon passes, but the evil long will remain. but good, though done